I used to have a really hard time getting into the horror genre, which, if you've been around the channel for a while, that might surprise you, but it's true. Everyone kind of starts off not liking horror because as kids, you're kind of kept away from it unless you find it on your own, but then as time goes on, the thrill of the scares becomes enticing. You go see each new Paranormal Activity movie with your mom because they're rated R, and jump scares give you a fright. The movies cause you to walk a bit faster in the dark hallways of your home, and as much as some people don't like to admit it, sometimes these harmless, scary movies can actually be a bit of fun when it comes to scaring yourself. But that's all the horror genre really was to me for a long time, because eventually you get so sick and tired of watching these idiots go into the basement or choose to run upstairs instead of towards the exit, and when something bad happens, you're kind of like, yep, I knew it. I said you shouldn't go in that basement when you're home alone, and you heard a chainsaw revving from down there, but you did it anyways. Now you're dead, and I don't feel all that bad. I had a really big issue with connecting with characters in horror movies, especially the more grounded, supernatural ghost stories. I had seen things like Alien and Predator and even things like The Conjuring and Insidious, and those did have characters that I grew to care for, but I really felt like that was just a rare case within the genre. My eyes didn't really open up and accept the genre as a whole until I watched The Haunting of Hill House in 2018. Again, that might sound crazy to a lot of you given the nature of my channel, but maybe because I was a bit late to the genre is why I find it so compelling. Hill House went against everything I had a bias against when it came to the horror genre. It's a grounded, supernatural ghost story, and I felt like 9 out of 10 times these weren't done that well. It had a lot of characters, sometimes making stupid decisions, sure, but oftentimes those decisions were made as kids, so I couldn't judge them too harshly for it. But what surprised me the most was how much I cared about each and every character. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the masterpiece that is The Haunting of Hill House, how its structure and characters propel this narrative forward, and how it stands and compares to everything now that we're 7 years removed from its release. So look out and try to catch all those background ghosts, try to piece together the different timelines and everything that happened on that night as we enter through the doors of Hill House. As with all my videos, this one's gonna have full spoilers for The Haunting of Hill House, so if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend going to check it out first, even if you aren't a fan of horror, because you might just get turned onto the genre the same way I did. Not so sure why you're here at this point, but anyways, you've been warned, here we go. So for those who haven't seen the show in a while or are just flat out ignoring the spoiler warning, The Haunting of Hill House centers on the Crane family, both as adults in present day and back when they were children living in the titular Hill House. Their memories and experiences at Hill House have shaped who they are as adults in many ways. We find out early on that their mother died at Hill House, and though her death is shrouded in mystery, we know that it happened on one fateful night at the house, the very last night they all spent there as children. The episodes focus on each of the 5 children, contrasting their current day lives with the things that happened to them as children at Hill House. It's told out of order, building suspense to that night at Hill House, allowing you to come to your own conclusions about the characters and who they are before seeing for yourself their history and experiences. But before I get into the characters themselves, I want to talk about this show in general and its creator, Mike Flanagan. I am a huge Mike Flanagan fan. I've already talked about this previously in my video about Midnight Mass. I think that both that show and Hill House are by far his best work. It's incredibly obvious that he was the one fully in charge of the show. All of the scene transitions in the show seem purposeful and intended in order to bridge together the scenes. The camera, right from the very beginning, is wide, almost conditioning you to look in the background for different things, which serves a purpose because all of the different background ghosts. For those that don't know, there are dozens of hidden ghosts in the backgrounds of scenes, never called attention to, never making their presence extremely known. They're just lurking in the shadows, sometimes even for just a second. Speaking of Midnight Mass, there's also a fair bit of monologues in this show. Not nearly as many as there are in Midnight Mass, but each major character more or less gets their own monologue across the 10 episodes. Some of them are given by side characters as well. I actually didn't remember this because the pace of the show is generally quicker than Midnight Mass, but they're still here, and unlike all the monologues in Midnight Mass, I actually like each and every one of them in this show. That being said, there's some bits of dialogue that I found to be a bit strange in this series. It's like the scene goes on for a second or a word too long. It's like that episode of Parks and Rec where Jean-Ralphio is rhyming but always messes it up in the end.
K to the N to the O-P-E, she's the dopest little shorty in all Pawnee, Indiana.
Why don't you just stop at Pawnee?
It leads to a lot of endings or openings right before the credits to the episodes being a little bit cheesy. Another thing I came to realize on this watch specifically was just how often Mike Flanagan reuses scares or horror elements. Rat poison is a big element to the third act of this show, just like it was a big element in the third act of Midnight Mass. One of the bodies found in the house bricked himself in behind the wall he was building, which is something that also happens in The Fall of the House of Usher. In the final episode, Theo gets covered by a bunch of dead, ghostly hands, and this happens in Flanagan's adaptation of Dr. Sleep as well. I'm not knocking Flanagan down or anything, but I did find this a little funny. I guess these are just trademark Mike Flanagan things. If there's ever some sort of theory I have about Flanagan's next horror project, I bet that it'll somehow involve rat poison in the third act. But like I said in the intro, this show has a large cast of characters, both past and present iterations of characters, side characters from those perspective timelines and episodes. So across the first 5 episodes, we get an insight into each of the 5 children, starting off with Steven. Steven is a one-man paranormal investigator team and best-selling author, but most importantly, he's a skeptic. In the first episode, titled Steven Sees a Ghost, he's investigating a case for his new book. A woman claims to be seeing her dead husband and all of the strange things relating to it, so Steve offers to sleep in that room that she saw him in order to try and get more information. Though some of the stuff she's saying, like how water was dripping from his body because he drowned, it actually does happen to Steve as well, but he dismisses it because it was raining that night and she has a leak in her roof. Despite actively searching for this ghost and even for the possibility of the case being real, he finds nothing but practical answers for all of her claims. But he still accepts the story and says that he'll write it because it's a good story. But he very clearly doesn't believe that or believe in his own work. This woman, who's a fan of his, asks in exposition about Hill House, what it was like growing up there, how his siblings are doing now, and how his dad should really write a book of his own. But Steve seems a little put off by all this conversation. Now personally, I love this kind of exposition. It's doing 2 things at once, cluing the audience in on the world, but also setting up a mystery, and this whole show does this a lot. There's a moment later in the first episode where we get to see a scene from that night, how there's something wrong with their mom, Luke talks about a girl named Abigail, and all this is done very well to hook us into the story. Of course, since this is the first episode, it still has to set up a lot of the characters and what they're doing in their adult lives, and we check in on everyone individually in their own sequence, except for Luke, who we only see briefly in the episode. But it's enough for the audience to judge him on his actions. The whole first episode, the audience is aware that something's wrong with Nell, the youngest girl in the family, and despite her efforts to reach her siblings, none of them pay her any attention until the end of the episode, where it's revealed she's actually dead. This is really the inciting incident of the plot and starts moving the gears forward, but it's still framed through Steve's point of view, where after all these years, he finally does see a ghost. The ghost of his now dead sister, which was a really great reveal and sets up Steven's character arc very well. Steven, in a lot of ways, is the most different from his siblings. He's like the black sheep of the family, even though the story's not really framed that way. He's the only advocate for mental health and how their mom and Nell both had issues with this, but everybody ignored it. This is also his coping mechanism. It's easier to blame his father for the things that went wrong and say that everybody else has mental health issues, but not himself. He thinks of himself as the golden child, the successful one and the one who's the most morally sound and secure than the rest of them. But as the series goes on, we see everybody else's interpretations of their brother. We see that Steve isn't the one who's morally right, and while he claims to be ahead of it, he ignores his own mental health issues, maybe more than anybody else does. The background ghosts in the first episode are much more hidden than the rest of the episodes because Steve never saw a ghost, or so he claims. The second episode focuses on Shirley, and Shirley is kind of the exact opposite of Steve. Steve didn't believe in ghosts or really any of the things the rest of the family does, and he goes out of his way to prove that he's right. But Shirley handled her childhood trauma differently, instead trying to actually understand death. This stems from her experience of finding a bunch of kittens at Hill House. There's 5 of them, representing the 5 kids, oddly enough without a mother, which also mirrors the 5 kids after their time in Hill House. Shirley doesn't handle death well. She denies Nell's death when Steve calls to tell her about it, but yeah, that's her sister, of course she does. But this goes back to the kittens, where she had a hard time processing the death of one of the kittens, named Jasper, desperately wanting the kitten to still be alive, even at its own funeral. At her mother's funeral, she can't stand to even go up and see her, yet in the future, she demands to be the one to prepare Nell, because this is her way of getting closure, and it's also her way of understanding death. While Steve rejects the idea of death and ghosts, Shirley goes above and beyond to try and comprehend how it happens. The kittens eventually all die, and her mom says that kittens can't survive without their mother, and both parents discuss how they've probably scarred her for life and she's gonna have a pretty messed up view of death. Transition to the future, and she very much does have a messed up view of death. But outside of the kittens, Shirley really gains this fixation from seeing her own mother at the funeral, in awe about how she was fixed and looked perfectly normal, which is exactly what prompts her to not only pursue this as a career, but fix Nelly and make her normal as well, which she, never really does. This body looks absolutely nothing like Nell whatsoever. Maybe that's a stylistic choice, but it just never looks like her, even when she's fixed. And the mom did look like the mom at the funeral, so maybe this is just supposed to show how bad Shirley is at her job. They said that this was too big of a job for her to deal with, and they should just let Carlisle handle it.
Why not send her to Carlisle? They'll do a great job there.
And you know what? Maybe he should have. Maybe even could have saved Nell's life. The third episode focuses on Theodora. Now, Theo is definitely the most different of her siblings. She's not like Steve, where she pushed the memories aside to focus on the tangible reality. She's not like Shirley, where she had to overcompensate for the losses to try and understand them. Instead, she tries to use her past trauma and help others from it. Theo has always been a little bit different after all. I mean, she is the middle child.
What did you think I said?
What makes Theo stick out are her abilities. Theo has heightened sensitivity to emotions, something that her mother and grandmother had too. Anything she touches, whether that be a person, place, or a thing, she can feel the emotions left behind. I've seen some criticism on this character trait of Theo's, claiming that it's unrealistic in this supernatural fantasy ghost story, but personally, I really like it. I think it adds a dimension to this story and of course the character of Theo, and makes her different from her other siblings in a way that she handles her trauma. Working in the foster care system and helping other children get over what she and her siblings cannot makes her this weird sort of superhero of the story. And throughout this third episode, it's basically like seeing an origin story in the past and defeating an enemy in the present. In the past, we see her mother noticing that something is off with Theo. She explains to her what these feelings are and even gives her a pair of gloves, kind of like a superhero getting their first suit. In the present, she goes above and beyond to help this young girl deal with her smile monster, ends up uncovering one of the most horrific monsters in the show, and defeats him. But she's of course not a superhero. She's angry at what Nell did because it's gonna further divide the family. She took Steven's so-called blood money, even if it was to further her own education, and she doesn't quite know how to handle her own trauma, spending her nights at the club and sleeping around like a frat guy, as Shirley calls it, and treating those who do want to open up to her like they're just a piece of meat. It would have been very easy for Mike Flanagan to make Theo the hero of this story, Kate Siegel, his wife, be the one that saves the day, rights all the wrongs of the past, but that's not Theo's character arc. That's not what the story ultimately is, but I'll get to more on that later on. This episode also furthers the hype around that night, with there being several scenes and even Theo confronting Steve about how he was asleep for 99% of that night, which is also a little funny, but again, more on that later. Going into episode 4, Luke was the character we had seen the least, probably even above Nell, who's dead. At least when it comes to present day Luke, but there was still all this mystery surrounding the girl in the woods he was seeing, named Abigail, in the past. Luke handles his trauma in what is probably the most expected or popular method of dealing with trauma, and that's drugs and alcohol. We've seen him briefly before he was seemingly off the deep end, but he's 90 days clean at the start of this story, except maybe not based on his appearance in the first episode. Again, I love how the story is structured. There's constant mysteries, questions, answers, and the timeline of everything with stories converging is a really intriguing way to watch the story unfold. Luke is disheveled, clearly struggling with his trauma, his addiction, and what he's put his family through all these years. He's in this rehab center going over the 4th step in the process, the step he always gets to before he breaks down again. This 4th step involves apologizing to your loved ones, and when Luke goes to think on this, it's always too much for him because he doesn't really know how to explain his sorrows to them. It's not that he doesn't feel bad, it's just that he can't quite put into words how he feels, and even if he could, it seems like nobody would be there on the receiving end to actually hear him out, which is pretty accurate from all the other siblings and the way that they talk about Luke. You can really feel his struggles and the pull he feels back to drugs from being outside of the rehab center in order to find his friend Joey. We're also introduced to, I think, the scariest ghost in the series, and that's the tall, floating bowler hat man. This is also one of the first very obvious ghosts we've seen, other than a few glimpses, a few background ghosts, and the bent neck lady. Each and every ghost we've seen and had extended glimpses of were from the perspective of either Nelly or Luke, with Luke getting the brunt end of things, and yet his parents still don't believe his stories. Even in the present time, when he leaves rehab to go and find Joey, he doesn't get the help that he needs when they try to return. The only person who's ever really been there for him was Nelly. It's a twin thing, you wouldn't understand, but I'll talk more about that when we get to Nelly. Luke talks with Steve about how getting over addiction is extremely cold, and when he breaks into Steve's apartment, he's extremely cold. We see the opposite side of this point of view presented in the first episode, and learn that Luke is really not off the deep end, but his entire body is cold and aching because his sister's dead. It's a twin thing. I wouldn't understand. This whole episode is really a commentary on addiction in general. As scary as the tall, floating bowler hat man is when Luke sees him in his everyday life, it's his addiction taunting him, reminding him that it's still there and it's not going anywhere. No matter how far away he moves from it, it will still be right there the moment he turns around. He gives an entire speech about how his mother's death was what caused him to start using, and he's so happy that he's 90 days clean, how terrible he feels about what he's done to his family, and this is all contrasted with what he's doing in the present, getting robbed, haunted, and at absolutely rock bottom. Steve was right in what he said in the first episode. There's no shortage of haunted people, and Luke might be the most haunted out of the entire Crane family. Naturally, we had a lot of questions leading to Nell's episode, mostly surrounding her death, the red room that Shirley mentioned, and why she was acting so strangely in the first episode. And then, of course, there was additional stuff, like the fact she was married. What happened there? It's not ever mentioned again otherwise up until this point. The whole way this season and story was structured was very much leading to all the questions being answered in this episode. And the beginning of this episode serves as a reminder to all those questions, the bent neck lady in particular. After that, the show almost makes you forget what show you're watching. Her love story with the sleep technician Arthur is very well done, it's heartwarming, and for a little while, all is right in the world. It was 2015 after all. There's even an actual hilarious moment where Steve and Nell watch as Shirley realizes that Theo is a lesbian that actually made me laugh. But very quickly, we're brought back to reality. Nell's having sleep paralysis, her husband goes to calm her down, as he's done in the past, but the most unfortunate set of circumstances happen, and Arthur drops dead, the bent neck lady seemingly responsible for it. As for the twin thing, after everybody's turned their backs on Luke, even after going through her own stuff and grieving her husband, Nelly is still there for Luke, even if the way she's there for him isn't exactly helping him. Nell's episode focuses not really on the ways in which she avoids seeking treatment, but how she ignores her treatment and goes off her medication. How her going off this medication apparently gives her a newfound confidence, a confidence that she didn't have when helping Luke get well. But all this is really doing is forcing her to push her family members away, antagonize Theo, call out Steve in front of a group of fans, and slowly drive herself insane. So this episode feels a little strange to me. The others all had pretty concrete messages and themes to them, but all I can really think of for this episode is to stay on your medication, I guess, which just kind of feels like a strange message to me. Please let me know what your take is in the comments, because I felt like this episode just didn't really flow all that well when it comes to handling or not handling trauma. We're given a lot of answers to Nelly's behavior in the first episode. We get to see her point of view through all these events, how ignored she is by her family, and how the bent neck lady seems to be following her, a sort of personification of Hill House itself, calling her back home like the drawings on the wall that she saw as a kid. When Nelly turned to her family, they weren't there for her, so she turned back to her home, and it welcomed her with open arms due to a mix of the house manipulating her, turning her insane, and turning her against everybody else. This is the episode where Hill House itself seems to become a character of its own, with its own motivations and characteristics. But then we get the big reveal, the reason as to why this is the highest rated episode of the show, and that's the reveal of who the bent neck lady is, and that's Nelly herself. Now, this is a great reveal. It's the end to a really big emotional sequence, but it's ultimately a pretty confusing reveal when you stop to think about it. So Hill House itself has the power to bend space and time, displacing a dead Nelly from the future into the past on multiple occasions, most of them outside of Hill House itself. It really begs the question about all these other hauntings. Why Nell was seen by Luke and Steven, if this bowler hat guy really is following around Luke, and there's not really anything else like this over the course of the season, maybe one other scene. So yes, this is a great twist, but it opens up a whole big can of worms that the show never really bothers to explain. So we've seen an episode from the point of view of each of the 5 kids, but we haven't seen them all together in the present time. So of course, that's what episode 6 is focused on, getting all the children and their father together for a highly emotional reunion/confrontation, bringing forth all the threads that were left dangling in each episode. And for a lot of reasons, we get what I believe to be the best episode of the show, and one of the best TV episodes ever made. This is the episode that I remember the most. I was in film school when this show came out, so naturally everybody was gushing about this episode in particular because of its many unbroken tracking shots. This is maybe the most technically impressive episode of television I've ever seen. The fact that this episode was rehearsed for months before they shot it, how they actually built the set around this episode, it's so impressive and it makes for such an entertaining episode. And like I said, this is the first episode that we were seeing all the siblings together in the present time. We knew that would bring forth a lot of drama and harsh conversations, and this episode did not disappoint. And setting not just one, but both storylines, past and present, during a storm just automatically raises the tension because storms are cool. So when the episode starts off, things aren't just blown up from the start. The sibling dynamic, despite their differences, really shines through in the opening minutes, and as time goes on, these walls slowly come down and the real issues come to a boiling point. All the alcohol might not help either, but what do I know? Shirley repeats exactly what Theo said to her, that she's angry Nell took her own life because she knows exactly what it does to a family, and then she says that she wishes Nell would have just talked to her, which is exactly what Nell tried to do in her final hours, to Steve as well. And I think Steve gets hit the hardest in these scenes, mostly because he's the one who's repressed or resented all his trauma the most. He's the one who breaks down when he sees Nell, he's the one who antagonizes their father, and it's kind of what blows the lid off for everybody to speak their own mind. The switch over to the younger actors, and in Hill House specifically, is maybe even more impressive, with all the camera movements, the statues being switched out, and of course, the kids. It's one thing for all the adult actors to nail this, but all these kids completely nail this scene too. Their acting doesn't seem too out of place or even dumbed down from the other scenes. This episode also furthers our worries for Olivia Crane, because it seems that the house is getting to her and Hugh can't reach her. The storm gets worse, the kids all scream, saying they saw a giant dog with glowing red eyes, but it's nowhere to be seen, and then neither is Nelly, so everybody stops to go looking for her. We switch back to the present time, where the funniest character is Shirley's husband Kevin, who's just trying to be a good host and then keep the family from escalating things even further, but then he's the one who kind of makes the biggest scene by telling Shirley that they actually did accept Steve's blood money, something Shirley was all too proud to have not done. Steve talks about the importance of mental illness, how this family has a history of it, and this is the problem with the family, while everybody else is more susceptible to the more paranormal side of things and wants to hear the truth of what happened at Hill House and what happened that night, though Hugh keeps that to himself. In the past, when they finally find Nell, she says that nobody heard her when she cried for help, which again rounds out the story about mental illness. When people cry for help, nobody's there until it's too late. This whole episode is about family trauma. We all have it. Maybe, well, hopefully none of you have it to the level depicted in this show, but that's another point that all stories make in general. Stories tend to show us the worst so that way we can compare it to our own lives, recognize the issues, and work out ways to solve them. Instead of letting the illness eat at you, you can try and speak up, or you can try and listen while others speak up. It's a very powerful message that this episode and this show in general tackles, all under the guise of being a regular horror series, and it's absolutely incredible storytelling. But after this episode, it felt like there was a fork in the road. Was it going to continue along this path of mental illness, proving Steven to be the person who was right in the family, or was it going to continue down the path of entertainment horror, a bit like in the 5th episode? But the answer is both, and it does this in a number of ways. After episode 6, there is a sort of noticeable dip in the storytelling, at least in the present timeline. Sure, there's still some stuff we want to know, particularly about the past and what really happened that night, but it seems like the present time, we've heard all the stories, we know all the characters, the themes about childhood trauma have all been relayed, and it just kind of seems like we're in the wrapping up stages of the present time stories, but there are still 3 episodes left. With how this entire story is structured, I almost feel like it would have been better to see a flash forward to all the adult characters in Hill House or something like that. Usually I'm not a big fan of those kinds of things, the whole showing a scene from the future and then cut back to a time frame amount earlier, but I think that this show would have been able to pull that off successfully. It's ultimately not that big of a deal because obviously this show is streaming, so it's not like you had to wait week to week, and it doesn't really bring this show down at all, but I just felt like I should mention it. But this episode is all about Hugh. Each and every scene takes place from his perspective, both in the past and present. He figures out about the black mold in the past, and in the present, we see that the person he's been talking to, when it seems like he's muttering to himself, is actually his dead wife, which isn't much of a twist, but actually says a lot about his trauma from the experience. He's forgiven himself for everything that happened with Olivia, because with her saying that they gave the kids a good role model, those last few days don't count because it wasn't them, this whole episode and Olivia as a ghost in general can be looked at in two ways. One, this is Hill House staying with him and continuing haunting him, or this is just a figment of Hugh's imagination and he's controlling what she's saying as a means to cope with his loss. I definitely think it's the latter because it's as if she can read his mind, speak on things he hasn't said aloud himself, and if this really was Hill House haunting him, it would be telling him far more sinister things. He also even later says that it is just his own coping mechanism, so yeah, it's definitely option number 2. But with Olivia actually being sensitive to emotions just like Theo, perhaps it really is her haunting over him, just in a nicer way. Again, more on that later. Now there's one thing that I haven't mentioned a lot, and that's the Red Room. The Red Room is this room in the house that no matter how hard they try, they cannot get it open. The keys don't work, so they kind of just leave it be. Now I love the whole idea of the Red Room, especially with what it actually turns out to be, but also, this is your house to make pretty again, Hugh. Just cut down the door and replace it. He even tries to do that in this episode, unsuccessfully, but just take an axe to it, like the character you portrayed in Dr. Sleep. I get that it's for the plot, but even in a supernatural fantasy horror show, this seems a little bit unrealistic. So now I'm going to talk about the monologue in this episode, because I think it's the best monologue in the show, and perhaps my favorite monologue across all of Flanagan's works. But in Hugh's episode, it's not Hugh who delivers it, it's actually Mr. Dudley, which, by the way, this actor is supremely underrated. I've only ever seen him in Flanagan works, but he always blows me away. His monologue in this show always captivates me. It's a 6-minute scene, mostly unbroken, and it's superb. He talks about the very real ways that this house affects people and how Hugh should get Olivia away from it as soon as possible. Flanagan always finds these super underrated actors and gives them really dramatic roles, and it's one of the reasons why I like his work so much. Also, little side note here, but this guy would have made for a kick-ass new Hagrid. Nick Frost is gonna do well, and sure, this guy might be a little bit too old, but he just looks like Hagrid to me every single time I see him. I just think Hagrid. So the next few things I'm talking about happen in episode 8, titled Witness Marks, but truthfully, not a whole lot happens in this episode. It's not focused on one specific character, it's really just setting up the final act. Luke ends up going missing, stealing Shirley's credit card and Theo's car, and everybody's mind goes to the worst possible thing, the audience included. But it turns out he's not breaking his sobriety, he's heading to Hill House to burn it down. But before we learn this, everybody splits up. Stephen and Hugh go driving around the city while Shirley and Theo are forced together. And these pairings are very intentional because of their issues with each other. And I think this is incredibly smart writing because it not only bridges their issues and problems into the third act, but it also speaks to both the past and present storylines. Stephen and Hugh have their issues because of things that happened in the past, while Shirley and Theo have their issues because of things that happened in the present. And I'm not too sure if this was super intentional or not, or if this is just how the cards fell when they were writing it, but it kind of retroactively gives both the past and present storylines their own conclusions with how these characters work through their issues. Steve has issues with his father because of the way he went about dealing with the family and their mother's death. Like I said earlier, it's easier for Steve to blame his father for everything that went wrong rather than face his own issues head on. Shirley is angry with Theo because she took Steve's blood money from his book on Hill House, but also she caught Theo and her husband together in a closet, so I can't really blame her there. While Steve and Hugh's issues persist until the final episode, Theo and Shirley more or less get to see eye to eye in this episode. Theo talks about how she couldn't feel anything after touching Nell, which is a scary thought itself because of Theo's powers and what happens to life after death, and grabbing onto Kevin was like a life raft. Even if all she felt was shame and grief afterwards, it's better than not feeling anything at all. which, again, is a pretty powerful message. But then we get to episode 9, which is all about Olivia. We've seen her slowly lose herself over the course of the season, and this episode serves as additional context for scenes that we've seen, but didn't see her perspective on. From simply time slipping away to her, to her getting headaches, hallucinations, and even seeing glimpses of the future. This is the only other time where the house does something like the whole bent neck lady reveal, where it breaks space and time, and it shows her a glimpse into Shirley's morgue, and both Nelly and Luke dead or dying. This still doesn't come with any explanation of any kind, it just happens to worsen Olivia's mental state, which, fair enough, but still doesn't answer any of my questions. Is Hill House some sort of TARDIS or something? About 3/4 of this episode is just additional context until we see new scenes, how Olivia doesn't actually leave to go to her sister Janet's, and it seems like the house has already taken her. Which leads us to the infamous final night of the house. For how much all this was built up, the reveal of Abigail being real and then poisoning her right off the bat does seem kind of underwhelming as a reveal. Olivia is trying to poison her kids to prevent the future that she saw and that the kids warned her about so that she can be there for them forever at Hill House. This makes sense. Seeing Abigail's death is horrific, all the puzzle pieces are there and they fit, but I can't help but feel underwhelmed by that night. Earlier in the series, Theo talks down to Steve because he was asleep for 99% of that night, but Theo wasn't involved in anything super important either. Without her insight, she knew the same amount as Steve did. It would be different if Theo was involved in this tea party, but she wasn't. There is certainly a message about seeking help before it's too late, and that definitely shines through, as does the story of her wanting to protect Luke and Nelly above the other kids because she feels they don't need her anymore. But I do feel like there's just one more key scene missing that is really the edge that Olivia is driven to. Like, as the story stands, I feel like if Hugh had just taken her away from the house, yeah, she still poisoned somebody, but Olivia might have actually ended up okay. In the grand scheme of things, Olivia is kind of the personification of the house, which makes her the villain of this story, and I am super sympathetic to her character, but to me, it just feels like she wasn't too far gone, even by this point. She just needed some help and to get away from the house, which may very well be the point, how nothing about that night happened the way it should have, but I do feel like it's a bit underwhelming because only 2 of the kids were really involved in that night, which was built up across this entire season. It was built up to be everybody was involved in it except for Steve, but Shirley and Theo weren't part of it either. So now we move on to the finale, and this is where I'm going to talk about the Red Room. I think the actual reveal of the Red Room from both Hugh and seeing it is a much better reveal than the bent neck lady. How there wasn't a treehouse, there wasn't a clock repairman, Steve never had a game room. It's such a great partial reveal from Hugh, and then in the finale we get to see how each of them actually had their own Red Room. It's such a great reveal because the clues were all there. Steve talks about Luke's treehouse with his mom, and she says, "Very funny, mister." Nell says that she found the teacups in the playroom, and Mrs. Dudley has no idea what she's talking about. Olivia has her reading room. Luke asks which room that is. I think this reveal works so well because this house is so massive that it seems realistic enough for there to be all these rooms for each of them, and it only makes sense once the reveal comes that this is the room they were all trying to get into the entire time, even though each and every person, maybe except for Hugh, have been in it themselves. This last episode also belongs to all of them. Seeing Steve and how he's narrating this episode from what we expect to be the future with his pregnant wife, how he's writing a sequel to Hill House, makes us believe that this will be his episode, but pretty quickly we see that this is all a figment of Hill House. Then we get to see Luke's imagination about how he wished things went with Joey, Shirley's flashbacks to when she cheated on her husband with, wait a minute, Nathan Scott? Theo then talks with the girl that she's been seeing and actually opens up to her. This is all of them facing their greatest fears. Steve starting a family, Shirley confronting her biggest mistake, Luke going back to drugs, and Theo finally opening up to someone. It's only after they face these fears and realize they couldn't possibly be real, getting heckled by the house itself, that they wake up. And even when they do wake up, it's not a triumphant moment because Luke is seemingly dead. Except he's really just on the verge of death, and even though the house is telling him to give in, the ghost of Nelly is telling him he shouldn't sit down, that he needs to go. Exactly what she told him when he saw her ghost in episode 4. Perhaps another moment of Hill House bending space and time. And it turns out to actually be her ghost, proving that the twin thing and love is more powerful than whatever haunting this house is doing. With the kids reunited, it feels like this turns into a message about grief and losing a loved one. Nell says that she's not gone, she's scattered around in many places, and she's always going to be there for them, and this scene made me feel a bit emotional. I've very fortunately never lost a sibling or somebody as close as a sibling, but I feel like if I had, I can see this entire sequence and message hitting home incredibly hard. By the end, the whole family, both living and dead, pierce through the hauntings of Hill House, the siblings getting their last moments together, Hugh and Olivia getting their time together, and Hugh making the ultimate sacrifice for all the kids to leave justifies his own character arc, but also allowed Steve to repair his relationship with his father, even if it came after death. They all eventually face these fears themselves that they saw in Hill House, and Hill House actually just basically gave them the courage to do it. And everything that they face goes surprisingly well. Everything with Abigail and the Dudleys and that whole twist feels a bit strange and convenient. The Dudleys didn't want to let their daughter out into the world because it would hurt her, yet them keeping her from the world is what led her to seek out friendship from Luke and sneak out at night. And them just covering up everything for Olivia and Hugh so that way they can keep on seeing their daughter. It's a lot of information and twists that you kind of just have to go along with because the more you think about it, the less it makes sense. I get them wanting to keep seeing their daughter, but were they really just never gonna let their daughter leave the house? Really, nobody else in the world knew about her? What kind of quality of life is that? What kind of parenting is that? It does wrap everything up into a nice bow for them and Hill House in general, but almost too nice of a bow. Basically, they all just live happily ever after. Sorta. So before I get into the theories regarding the ending, there are quite a few unanswered questions that we're left with when the season is all said and done, most of them regarding Hill House itself. Some of these do have concrete answers from outside the show itself and the lore, others not so much. But in an early episode, the kids talk about dogs on the property, and Mr. Dudley has no idea what they're talking about because he's never seen dogs anywhere. In the episode 2 Storms, the kids talk about seeing a massive dog/wolf with glowing red eyes, but the parents and the audience never see anything of the sort. There was also this monstrous growling noise in the walls, but none of this ever adds up to anything. But Mike Flanagan took to Reddit to address some of these things, explaining that in the script, at the beginning of every other episode, there would have been some additional scenes and context regarding different hauntings, one of which was the dogs. And I believe that they must have either shot or planned to shoot these scenes, because there are some promo pictures for these actors and these scenes. The dogs belong to the original owner, Mr. Hill. These dogs ended up killing a cat, which sort of explains the kittens, I guess, especially if the house can warp space and time. But Mr. Hill eventually jumped from the tallest tower of Hill House, his famous bowler hat, then going to his son, the massive ghost that we see looking for this bowler hat that eventually goes on to haunt Luke. The dogs were eventually killed by a woman named Hazel, who told the caretaker to leave them be, but he buried them anyways, and they continue to haunt the grounds of Hill House. Doesn't really explain the massive glowing red eyes bit, but I wouldn't put it above the house's power to manipulate things like this. Another strange thing that is sorta implied but not really explained is the storm that only affected Hill House. The Dudleys say that there was never anything like that at their house and they're just a short walk away. It's implied that Olivia is the cause of these storms, both because of the story she tells Mrs. Dudley about making it rain rocks when her father died, but also because her headaches are called dream storms by Hugh. Might be a little bit of a stretch there, but even in the future when they're all gathered at Shirley's, the storm only affects where they are. Steve says that the whole rest of the road has power and they're the only ones without it. And we know that Olivia is there because she's speaking with Hugh. So does this kind of confirm that she's more than just a figment of Hugh's imagination? That Olivia is the cause of not one, but two storms? Again, might be a bit of a stretch, but I think it works. Then there's, of course, the mold. And this is where we get into theory territory. Some people look at this story and say that there was never any ghosts at all, and the Crane family was having one big hallucination that was caused by long-term exposure to black mold. Now on paper, sure, this could work as a theory, but the more you look into it, the less it makes sense. The house was haunted long before the Crane family settled in. Both Mr. and Mrs. Dudley were in the house for long periods, and yes, Mrs. Dudley did see some strange things, but as we learned in Mr. Dudley's monologue, after she stopped going to the house at night, all those hallucinations stopped. This wouldn't be the case if it was because of the black mold. The kids all see strange things throughout their time at the house, all except for Steve, which wouldn't make sense if he was just as exposed as the rest of them. I think if this theory were to really hold any weight, then there should have been a line in the show about how the black mold wasn't in Steve's room, but it was in every other room. How would that work logistically? I don't know, but the mold worked in mysterious ways, so it could have done so purposefully, but that didn't happen. When they find the mold, sure, both Hugh and Steve work on getting rid of it with masks on, but we see that there are still times they're both in there without masks on, so that doesn't really fit either. The only thing that gives this theory a little bit of credit comes from Steve himself, where he says that ghosts are often a wish, and sometimes seeing people dead or deformed is better than never seeing them again. Along with Theo's mantra about feeling something is better than feeling nothing at all. If the house were just one big hallucination of the family, then perhaps that's better than just never seeing anybody or never feeling anything again. But personally, I don't really buy into this theory. But that does lead me into my next theory, which I do buy into. And that has everything to do with the ending. For as dark and sad this show is, the ending is actually really happy. Like, this is a very happily ever after type of ending. Everything turns out okay for every person that we see in the flash to the future. But what if everything was happy because the house was making them see things this way? Yes, in this theory, probably heard this one already, but I believe all of them are dead. They all died that second night at Hill House, but their combined efforts and powers are more powerful than Hill House is. Now, when I say powers, I do mean more than just Theo, because this show demonstrates these siblings having unique powers that brings them all together. In the first episode, everybody wakes up at 3 a.m., or midnight for the West Coasters, and this is the exact moment that Nell died. Shirley even says when she wakes up that Nelly's in the red room. How did she know that? Sure, we've seen all of Theo's powers, we've seen the twin thing between Nelly and Luke, how that works in mysterious ways. When Luke broke his ankle, Nelly called and said that her ankle was hurting too. When Luke gets clean, Nelly had the worst flu of her life, and when Nelly dies, Luke feels aches and pains and feels that his body is stiff. But what about Shirley and Steve? The two who are complete opposites in many ways, we never really saw them exhibit any powers outside of this moment. Well, that might be true for Shirley, but that's not the case for Steve. For everybody's red room, it was a room that was solely theirs. Nobody else ever came into it, except for Steve. Steve was in Luke's treehouse, aka Luke's red room, and we never saw anybody else exhibit this kind of power before. And if another theory is true, with the basement being Hugh's red room, then Steve was also able to go into his father's red room. Perhaps this is why they can all stay together in the house, in the red room, because Steve is somehow able to bridge the gap of everybody's room. Because in this scene, where they're all celebrating Luke being clean for 2 years, this isn't real, this is in the red room. It's too happy of an ending. Steve and his wife are having a baby, Theo and this girl are in a relationship, and Shirley and Kevin worked out their issues. Not to mention, the background painting resembles the same window that's in the red room. I'm not going to say that this is the definitive answer, mostly because Mike Flanagan himself said that it isn't, but I'm also not going to act like this wasn't intentional. Even the framing of this shot makes it seem like they're in the red room. If the painting looking like the window had no significance, then the show just wouldn't have framed it. The shot would not be framed this way. But I can also see why Flanagan himself has debunked this theory, because what does that say about the show's theme overall? That you'll get your happily ever after once you're dead? That's a pretty grim message. But being able to overcome your past trauma, no matter how long it's stuck with you, and live a happier life afterwards, is a great message, and overall what this show is all about. Moving past your trauma and bettering yourself, because once you do that, it seems like everything else around you is much better as well. The Haunting of Hill House is a phenomenal show. It's the series that really turned a corner for me when it comes to horror. It's a show that I've revisited every year since it's come out. And maybe this is recency bias because I said the same thing about Midnight Mass when I watched that, but I think this is Mike Flanagan's masterpiece. So I'm going to give the show a rating. I think it deserves one of only 8 things on my IMDb to achieve this, but I'm giving The Haunting of Hill House a 10 out of 10. Are there issues? Sure. Is anything really perfect? No, it's not. But a perfect ranking means that you're able to completely and totally love something past its flaws, and that's what The Haunting of Hill House is for me. So if you're still here, thanks for watching the video. This is a bit longer than I expected it to be, but let me know your thoughts on Hill House. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stuff like this. If this video can get to 5,000 likes in the first week of release, I'll be making a poll asking you guys which Flanagan series you want me to cover next, and whatever wins that will be the next video of this series. Special thanks to all my channel members. You guys are the best, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Call the sleepers from your crystal.